Hey everybody, thanks for joining me tonight. Sorry it took me a couple minutes to get on here. I was kind of waiting for Jerry at Happy Place Diaries to kind of finish up his stuff, and I was having some internet issues a little while ago, and I'm hoping those got all worked out and that we're able to get through this tonight. I want to welcome a few people in the room. Teresa at Menta VRVN was first in the room, and thank you for joining us tonight, Teresa. Aaron Jameson, appreciate it, sir. And we have, of course, Mel and Nettie living free zip codeless. Good to see you, Nettie. And Sue at Lucky Dog Productions moderator. Artist on the Road, Linda Baker, James Cantonese, K&R Destinations. And I think I've got through all of them here. Oh, Roy and Becky's Travels in the room. Thank you, Roy and Becky. Chat's going kind of quick here. I been watching Bob's Adventure. Adventure. I've been watching Bob do some of his little stream bots and stuff like that. So I thought I'd try to give it a shot here and see if it's working. And looks like it jumped in the room there. Well, not a lot going on tonight. It's going to kind of give an update. We're finishing up, update to our full-time launch. We're just finishing up our last couple yard sales over the next week and a half, and we should be pulling out of our driveway of our sticks and bricks for the last time. I'm thinking right around the 1st of August. So we're down to the last 10, 11 days, and we're kind of looking forward to getting on the road, but yet we're a little hesitant about leaving it all behind, but we're taking the risk and going for it. Kind of some things that's happened over the last week. We finally got through my daughter's high school graduation. They were able to have an in-person graduation, and we got to have 4 family members there in attendance, and it turned out pretty good. And we were really excited to see our daughter graduate high school and actually get to have the experience of walking across the stage in front of her schoolmates and her family and capping off the last 12 years of her schooling. So that was great to see, and she really made me proud in everything that she has done through her school, and we're looking forward to getting her into college over the next couple months and seeing her journey as an adult get started, and it's our youngest, and so it's kind of a surreal type of deal where it's kind of hard to see him grow up, but yet again it's one of those deals where you can't wait for the day, and you wish you could look back, and I wished I could go back to when she was just a baby, but anyway, so that's kind of where we're at on the full-time launch. I thought I'm gonna just a second here. Can everybody hear me all right? And is the video going good here? I'm kind of worried my internet's giving out. Yeah, it's looking good on my YouTube end. Going through the chat here to see if anybody news came in, and gonna welcome them in. Thanks, Nettie. Thank you, Linda. Appreciate that. The bot's working. I had the Nightbot dropping the link for our podcast, Stories of Sacrifice. I'm going to play you a quick video podcast here in just a few minutes of video podcast I did about Private First Class Juan Gutierrez, who was missing in action in the Philippines. Well, he actually died in POW Camp Cabanatuan in 1942, and his remains, or what they thought was his remains, were sent home to Santa Fe to be buried by his family, and it turns out they had the wrong person in the wrong grave. And so I'm going to play a little podcast story about Private First Class Gutierrez and me contacting their family and getting his remains disinterred and a proper identification done. Hey, Gary, about daydreams, about nice things. Good to see you, man. I appreciate you joining in. Scott Jacobs, in appreciation. Hey, Scott, how's it going, buddy? Thanks, Nettie. At the rate I'm going here, Gary, about getting downsized, I think you're going to beat me getting done here. I'm doing the yard sale thing right now too, and right in the middle of all of it, and I think you should come to Colorado and run my yard sales for me, buddy. Welcome to the live stream, RV Weekends. Good to see you here. Yeah, it looks like the Nightbox is working pretty good. Like the bot is saying there, he says, I want to say thank you to all of our subscribers. I'm very humbled for each of you that takes the time to join us in our live streams and support us in what we do. Appreciate it. Hey, Bob's Adventure. Good to see you, Bob. Yeah, it's Nightbot's working, and the other one dropped in, so it should be dropping a link here pretty quick. If anybody hasn't been watching Bob's Adventures live streams here over the last few days, he's been doing some pretty good live streams about kind of simplifying the chat and adding chat bots to your chat to drop links and welcome guests and things like that, and it kind of takes some of the pressure off of your moderators. But thankfully, I don't have a huge channel yet, so I don't have a lot going on there. But it's kind of neat to see how you can simplify this chat and stuff. Also, to the moderators in the room, if you would feel free to drop your links to your channels anytime. Bob, please drop yours in there. I think everybody in here is pretty much subscribed to everybody, but if you're not, check each one of these channels out and go watch their videos and make comments and yeah, it does help a lot, Bob. It's kind of neat seeing it work. And like I said, all the information you shared on your live stream, I kind of added the steps that you took, and it seems like everything's working kind of smooth. Yeah, I had too, Roy and Becky's travels. I kind of worried about it going rogue too. So I didn't give it any moderator features. I just put it in there to where it could drop links. I heard some bad stories about it booting people, so I'll just rely on my regular channel moderators to kind of watch and make sure everything runs smoothly with the chat. So, but I've never had any problems. So, hey, thanks, Bob. Well, I'm going to go ahead and play this podcast real quick for y'all. Like I said, I hope you enjoy listening to it. And what's it saying there? A searcher tip. I don't know what that is, but anyway, I'm going to go ahead and play this video podcast that I did here a few weeks ago about Private First Class Juan Gutierrez. Just kind of a little backstory on Juan. Like I said, his remains were tentatively or identified back at the end of World War II and sent home to his family. For Leverland RV, thanks for joining us. Yeah, we should have a downsizing race too. I'm about downsized. It's just the fact of getting it all sold, because if I don't get it sold, it's going to Goodwill. Thanks, Nettie. Appreciate that. Anyway, the backstory on Juan is his remains were identified or incorrectly identified back after World War II. His remains were sent home to his family in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he was buried at the Santa Fe National Cemetery there. But through some litigation from another family, trying to get their loved one identified, it was determined that they had the Hispanic remains in the lab in Hawaii that actually belonged to Juan. They did it through a process of elimination in determining that Juan was incorrectly identified, and the Defense POW-MIA accounting agency for the last few years has been trying to locate Juan's current family descendants, but we're unable to. So I had saw a newspaper article and also saw a deal on Stars and Stripes about the DPAA, or the Defense POW-MIA accounting agency, trying to locate his family. So I did some quick research into him, and took about an hour, and I was able to locate his sister's stepdaughter. And his sister's stepdaughter his sister had actually moved to Flagstaff, Arizona back in the mid 50s. And I was able to locate her stepdaughter. And through that process, I sent the information on to the U.S. Army Casualty Office, and they were able to reach out to the family and actually get permission to disinter the grave. During this process, in between, the government actually went to the federal court there in Santa Fe was trying to get his remains disinterred, but we were able to get the family's permission in the end. So I'll go ahead and play this podcast for you real quick here, and I'll join you all in the chat while it's playing. Give me a second here. All right. Let's see if it's going to work here. And my internet's not all that great tonight. Let me try this in here just a second.
Good evening.
Okay, there it's going to go. Let me share the screen again. Again, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining.
For decades, a family believed their son was buried at the Santa Fe National Cemetery.
But his remains recently turned up somewhere else. It had the Army exhuming a grave today to find out who really has been buried there. News 13's Rachel Knapp reports.
A major shift in World War II happened after the Japanese defeated American and Filipino troops on the Philippine Islands in 1942. Those troops were sent on the infamous Bataan Death March to the Japanese POW camp. One of the 2,800 prisoners who died in the camp was Private First Class Juan Gutierrez.
Gutierrez passed away on November 19th, 1942. There were 13 other people that passed away on that date. They were all buried in one grave.
After the war ended, the military believed they found Gutierrez's remains and sent them back to his family, who buried him here at the Santa Fe National Cemetery in 1950. Years later, when DNA analysis became a useful tool to identify soldiers' remains, the Department of Defense came across more of Gutierrez's remains in a mass grave in the Philippines. So, who was buried in his grave in Santa Fe?
It was during that time frame that the Department of Defense realized that there was commingling amongst those remains.
In order to find out, the Army had to petition the courts to exhume the grave since they couldn't find any of Gutierrez's immediate family. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs eventually agreed to do the disinterment, which crews began working on today.
We have to separate out the remains that are in that casket that aren't Gutierrez's, and then so it's kind of like putting a puzzle back together.
The military hopes to finally put Gutierrez's and the other soldiers' remains to rest, and will give them full military honors when they are reburied.
You have to do the moral thing.
Rachel Knapp, KRQB News 13.
The military tells us they eventually found Gutierrez's family in California, and they gave permission to exhume the grave. We're told about 37,000 soldiers' remains are still unaccounted for from World War II.
Welcome. Stories of Sacrifice, World War II American POW-MIAs in the Philippines. This is a production of the U.S. POW-MIA Family Locating. I'm your host and lead researcher, John Barrett.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Welcome to today's Story of Sacrifice podcast. Today we want to bring you a story that's very near and dear to our hearts because it's a case that we personally worked on. The wrong remains buried by the wrong family. Another misidentification, the case of Private First Class Juan F. Gutierrez. Mistakes are a fact of life. What counts is the response to the errors. Ever wonder why the U.S. government does not want to identify the missing from World War II? Listen on. The U.S. government expends great effort in telling the public how hard they work to recover the remains of American service members from all the wars. Yet they expend even greater effort in avoiding actually recovering and identifying those remains. The Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency's Public Affairs Office seems to produce more than the identification laboratory. Like many things the government does, it makes no sense until one knows all the circumstances. Last week we told you the story about Private Arthur H. Bud Kelder and his family struggle to bring his remains home for burial. Many of the listeners found it unbelievable that the U.S. government would obstruct the return of the remains of American service members. The story is that Bud was one of 14 Americans imprisoned in Cabanatuan POW camp in the Philippine Islands who died on November 19, 1942. All 14 were buried in a communal grave, number 717 in the camp cemetery. After the war, American forces opened the cemetery and moved the remains to a temporary cemetery known as Manila Number 2. One man was quickly identified on the basis of a dog tag found with his remains. 3 more were identified from dental records subsequently received from the States. The remaining 10 were ultimately buried as unknowns in the Manila American Cemetery. Their families were told only that their son's remains were non-recoverable, with no explanation of what that meant. The implication was that no remains existed, as the Army had never even hinted that they may be part of a group burial. To the families of these unknowns, it was like they had fallen off the face of the earth, and the Army wasn't sharing with what they knew. In 2010, a member of Bud's family sought records of his death from the Army, who happily obliged and provided the file. It was immediately obvious from the records that Bud was one of 10 unknowns buried in Manila, but which one? The Army had been quite cooperative in providing the personnel file, but dug in their heels when the burial records that would identify an individual were requested. A nerve had obviously been hit, and the government was finished cooperating. It took a trip to federal court to obtain the record under Freedom of Information Act. The records were obviously releasable, but the government lawyers presented numerous extraneous objections in order to delay public release of the records known as X-Files. Fortunately, Bud's older brother, Dr. Herman Kelder, a dentist, left behind an oral history tape that mentioned that Bud had extensive gold dental work. It took 3 years and a federal lawsuit to obtain the records of the 10 unknowns from grave 717, but only one of them, X816, was shown to have any gold dental work. This should have been a slam dunk identification based on substantially better evidence than any of the World War II era identifications. But the family's requests for the remains were either rebuffed or totally ignored by any and all government agencies involved. And a sadly morbid side note, while the gold dental work was detailed on the first dental chart made when the remains were recovered from Cabanatuan Cemetery, all the precious metals subsequently disappeared from the remains. So much for protection of the remains by the Army. At least the dental record remained for the identification of the remains. It was later shown that not only had no other unknowns from Manila been identified in modern times, but perhaps more tellingly, documents surfaced showing that the government agencies had not only knew the identities of the remains, but they were also aware of the government's incompetence and misconduct. The government knew they had a problem. Actually, they had many problems, and they were of their own making. They definitely did not want to open this Pandora's box. It took another trip to federal court before the unknowns from grave 717 were disinterred for identification. Right from the beginning, almost if by design, they had made a mess of the recovery of remains from Cabanatuan POW camp. The prisoners had secretly kept extensive records of deaths and burials. However, unlike other POW camp burial records, such as Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan burial records, did not record each man's position in the communal grave. Not to be bothered by little details, the grave's registration personnel assumed that, like other camps, the burials were in roster sequence, so they officially identified the remains on the basis of their sequence in the burial roster. After several hundred remains had been transferred from Cabanatuan to Manila Cemetery No. 2 and buried under the incorrect name determined from the burial roster sequence, the mistake was realized and all the disinterment reports were corrected. All the records were corrected except the cemetery burial record. So as to dental records were obtained and compared with the skeletal remains, more identifications were made. Unfortunately, as the remains were identified, the cemetery was told to ship the remains previously misidentified on basis of the burial roster sequence. So while some mother's son had been identified, some other mother's son's remains were shipped to her for burial in the States. But this wasn't the worst of it. For some, as yet unexplained reason, the Graves Registration Command in the Philippines refused to employ any trained personnel to properly reassociate the remains, preferring instead to the use of contract civilian embalmers. While there is no indication that the remains were commingled in the communal graves, the untrained embalmers diligently sorted the remains based on color and size and hopelessly commingled the remains. In the case of Bud Kelder, for example, a few token bones returned to his family have come from 5 different caskets. It is not improbable that a bit of each of the 14 men were present in each of the 14 caskets. While each of these problems might be attributed to honest mistakes, it is the response to the error that counts. If the mistakes were sad, the government response was totally shameful. Not only were multiple government agencies aware of the mistakes that many, perhaps most families had received the remains of some other family's son, but they worked to continue to cover up and to this day diligently fight any request to return the remains. In a final display of incompetence in Grave 717 case, the Defense POW-MIA accounting agency was unable to locate a family member to consent to the exhumation of Private First Class Gutierrez, and finally asked a federal judge to allow them to proceed. A private individual, which was myself, using only publicly available data, was able to locate a close family member in less than 1 hour of research. Now, more than 3 years after the last occupant of Grave 717 was exhumed for identification, a few token remains from each man has been identified and returned to their respective families for burial. The Kelder family, after 4 trips to federal court, is believed to have received the largest amount of remains, about 10 large bones. The balance of the remains, which were virtually complete when exhumed from Cabatuan, will likely be cremated and disposed of regardless of each family's religious beliefs. So how does a crack government agency screw up so often with such consequences without learning anything? It looks like the Defense POW-MIA accounting agency has a long heritage of incompetence. Cabatuan Grave 717 was the first of a handful of similar cases disinterred for identification, but it was not in the least atypical, either in the facts or the government's effort to conceal their incompetence. Rather than leverage what they had learned from Grave 717, the DPAA continues to find new ways to avoid identifying the more than 1,000 unknowns from the Cabatuan.
Overall, thank you for listening to Stories of Sacrifice, World War II American POW-MIAs in the Philippines. This has been a production of the U.S. POW-MIA Family Locating. You can find us on the web at uspowmiafamilylocating.com. Opinions expressed in this podcast are our own and given in the best intention. Overall, the POW-MIA accounting community is doing what it can with limited resources. It is our hope additional federal funding will be provided, along with additional partnerships established to disinter and process the remains of our unknowns located in the national cemeteries. You can help by contacting your congressional representatives and asking that they implement a DNA policy for those unknown POW-MIAs. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, everybody, for a fairly interesting case. Like I said, it was another family who had was suing the government in federal court to get their MIA relative identified, and after the Defense POW-MIA disinterred all the individual unknown graves associated with that common grave burial at the POW camp, they were able to determine that they had a set of Hispanic remains in their lab there in Hawaii, and there was only one Hispanic POW that had been buried that day, and and they were able to determine that it was Juan Gutierrez. So to get the fullest possible accounting, they needed to disinter that grave in Santa Fe to get the remains out of that grave so they could send them to the right family. But anyway, it was kind of humbling to be able to identify or to find Juan's family and pass that information on to the Army. There should be some news coming out about it in the very near future about actually identifying Juan and getting the right remains to the right family. So how you doing, RV Reviews by the Air Force Guy? Thanks for joining in. So anyway, that was kind of what I had on the agenda for tonight. On Wednesday, I'm looking forward to joining Mel and Eddie and Meant to Be RVN and BB3 on their live stream that's going to be coming up on Wednesday. I think Nettie was dropping or going to drop the link or had dropped the link. I didn't notice. Nettie, if you want to go ahead and drop that link, please do. But I'm going to join them on their live stream. Let's talk about it live, and where they're going to interview me, and hopefully they're nice to me. Jerry Hawley, thanks for joining us. Uncle Lisa's Production, good to see you. But anyway, that's pretty much all I had for this evening. I'm going to go ahead and get off here. There's the link to the live that's going to be coming up with Let's Talk About It. We're looking forward to it. So anyway, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining in, and I'm going to go ahead and end the live a little bit early and give somebody else a chance. Is there anybody up coming up later tonight that's going to be doing any live streams? Sue, you would never be out of a job. Anyway, again, I got a visitor here that wants to say hi real quick. This is my wife's better half. She sounds just like a pig snorting. She's jumping up on my leg here. Shannon went out to go get us some dinner, so Kinsey just thought she needed to make a guest appearance. Gotta stay off the thing, babe. Not the mouse. Want to say hi? So anyway, again, thanks everybody for joining in, and we again, I'm looking at the schedules here, and I'm going to try to start doing weekly live streams, and we'll let you all know when that happens. But again, I want to say thank you for coming in, and we'll see you again here in another chat, and see you again live here real soon. We'll talk to y'all later. Thanks.